Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. And this week we're going to focus in on the challenging topic of managing redundancy. In fact, how we can manage redundancy sensitively and positively. And I'm delighted I've got Jill Aburrow here from Heartfelt HR, who's an expert in this area. She's got an HR career of nearly 30 years and she's worked with all sorts of businesses in that, from large global businesses to small charities with a handful of employees. She's a chartered member of the CIPD, postgraduate certificate in employment law, and really specialises and often advises on redundancy issues. So her company is Heartfelt HR, which gives a lovely indication of the approach that you'd like to take, Jill. Would you like to explain how you started to specialise? Obviously, you've got a long career. How long you've been specialising in redundancy and managing that area?
Well, it sort of, I fell into it really. My HR career, as you say, has been for a long time, and I've always been a generalist, and redundancy happened right from the very early days of my HR career. I was dealing with redundancies and supporting them, and I've learned such a lot along the way doing that. And it just in my last corporate role, I ended up mentoring other people who were in the HR team and were doing redundancies, and they clearly didn't really know how to approach it all. So I just gave them the benefit of my experience, and I realized that I got a lot of experience and lots of lessons on how not to do it, as well as things that work for people. So that's really how I fell into it, and more I was asking to support businesses with redundancies. So that is really my specialism now.
So you've obviously put that into your book as well, haven't you? So you've written a book, Redundancy with Love, that people can refer to, and I guess sharing that knowledge more widely.
Yeah, absolutely. The book came really because there's a lot of stuff out there on Actus and other places about what to do in the redundancy process, but there was very little on how to do it. And for me, that's critical. Because it can make the difference between it being a total disaster for everybody and actually being positive for those taking part. And I've worked with so many managers and HR people who really don't know what they're doing with it. And it's frightening if you don't know. And so I wanted to help people to understand really how to approach it all. And that's what the book is about.
Yeah, I think that's such a valid point. The whole thing is not so much what you do, it's how you do it, because it could be the worst thing in the world for someone, but actually could be the best thing in the world. But a lot of the difference between those two options are going to be how it's handled, I guess, when you're working with people.
Absolutely. And, we're all different, so we all react differently to everything. And managing all of that is really quite a fine art.
Yeah, and before we go into some of the practicalities of how you do it, I'm interested in, it's one of those things also, because the way people do react differently, and some of how they're going to react would depend on their circumstances. Let's say, you've just, your partner's been made redundant, or you've just had a life change where you've got to take on a huge mortgage or a small child or something. There must be lots of other things which obviously the organisation can't take those into account when deciding who to make redundancy or whether to do them, but they are going to impact on how people respond.
Of course they are, and we've all got things going on in our lives that our workplace doesn't know anything about necessarily, and shouldn't know anything about. But even if you're absolutely fine financially and haven't got any of those issues, being told that the job that you've done for a while, you're no longer going to be doing it, it's a real life changer. It's a real shock for, even if people have volunteered, to be honest, it's a shock.
It's changed. It's huge change. They're going to go through lots of strange feelings, aren't they? Do you see that there's more going on at the moment? Is there, in terms of, you've obviously been working in this area for a number of years, would you say that people are responding differently to redundancies, or there are more redundancies, or is it similar to how it's always been over the last sort of 10 years?
It's similar to how it's always been. I mean, there are always ups and downs in redundancies. There are ebbs and flows in how businesses manage, and it's a part of working life now. It's quite rare to meet somebody who's gone through their whole career and not been made redundant at some point during it. So it is a fact of life, but that doesn't make it any easier for the people who are either going through it or having to put other people through it.
Absolutely. So let's go into some of the practicalities then in terms of this. Now, obviously, there are natural responses which vary from person to person. What sort of reactions do you expect, or would you, when you've been training people on this or supporting others, what do you sort of coach them to expect in terms of reactions and how to manage them?
Well, the first thing is expect the unexpected, because you just never know what you're going to get. I've had people who've burst into tears. I've had people who've cheered. I've had people who've rushed across the room and thrown their arms around me. There will be any sort of reaction. For some, it's a bit like being bereaved, and they need time to grieve. For some, even if it's voluntary, as I said earlier, it's frightening, and I mean, I was made voluntarily redundant at one point, and even though I'd said yes, put my hand up and said yes, I will take redundancy, I still felt rejected. I still felt as if they should be saying to me, no, you can't possibly go, we need you too much. And that feeling was still there even though I'd volunteered. And so you can't assume that just because people are ostensibly happy to be leaving, it means that actually they're comfortable with the situation or feel confident about what they're going to be doing next.
So you're saying if someone does run across the room and is really appears to be quite pleased with it, do you go, oh great, that's fine, I don't have to worry about them? Or do you feel that sometimes those emotions are transient and you've got to be aware of they might change?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, occasionally somebody knows they're going to get a really good package. They've got other plans in place, and they really are genuinely quite happy. In my experience, that's fairly rare, but it does happen. But just, you can't predict how people will be, you can't always necessarily get into their heads and know how they're feeling. And the most common reaction of all is denial. Is people just don't accept that it's happening to them, and the key lesson really is to repeat and make sure that they understand what's happening and that they are actually going to be out of work at the end of this, because it's a real shocker. And one of the very early things I learned in my career was I went through a redundancy process with a young lad, and come the date when his work finished, he turned up for work the next day. And it was really, really shocking and horrible for everybody concerned, because he just had not understood. And that was because he'd not wanted to understand. So he hadn't listened and he hadn't taken it in. And that was a really good lesson for me, but it was a really tough one as well.
So if you were practically making sure, I guess the stuff that you have to do in terms of communicating, is there something you would do? Can you talk specifics as to what you would do to make sure someone has understood and to help them through the denial stage?
Well, more than one redundancy meeting is usually needed. Consultation is, as long as consultation takes. There are no rules about how long there are. If there's a large number of people being made redundant, there are guidelines around how long consultation should take. But for an individual redundancy, there's no rule about how many meetings you have to have with someone. It should be just a reasonable amount to make sure that they understand and have had a chance to answer all their questions. But for me, more than one meeting, or at least keeping the door open in between meetings to make sure that they can answer any questions, and make sure you do answer any questions. And use more than one method to give the message. Obviously a face-to-face meeting, or these days over Zoom or Teams or whatever, is perfectly acceptable, but follow it up in writing and make sure that there's something written down that they can refer to later.
With the specifics, because if they're in shock, they're not necessarily going to have taken it all in, are they?
No, and they'll have questions, and they won't think of those questions at the initial meeting. And so you need to be there to answer all those questions for them, because that will make them feel more comfortable with it and accepting of it.
Can I just go back to a what fact, because I'm rusty on this. So I think in my head, I thought you had to have 30 days, or there was a sort of recommended, or is that best practice? Is that about a number?
Yeah, it's 30 days is if it's over a certain number of people being made redundant, the collective consultation with the trade unions or the employee representatives has to be 30 days. But if you're just making one person in the business redundant, you can do it the next day. I wouldn't recommend that, but it's perfectly within the law to do it the next day.
What would you recommend then if you are working in a smaller business? What's the right amount of time and the right amount, a rule of thumb for it?
It will vary. It's as long as that person needs to come to terms with it, to make sure all their questions have been answered. And you can set up meetings and think, well, I'll only need this one meeting or maybe two. But then when you have to be guided by the conversation during those meetings and what they say and the things they raise. And my experience is that people always raise things that you're not expecting. So you need to go away and find out the answers for them. And it's really about managing that whole process of the conversation with them.
And actually, I mean, on that then, because I think with small companies and with the odd person, then someone, and I appreciate it could be a denial response, or it could be a legitimate response. If someone went into sort of anger or sort of that this is unfair, I'm being picked on, it's not, you shouldn't be doing this. What would you do in that situation? I imagine you've seen the whole gambit of responses.
Yeah, a business should have very clear reasons why the redundancies happened, and they should be well documented so that people know about that before they even get as far as having the consultation meeting. And it should be very clear as to why the business has made that decision to let certain jobs go. And yes, of course, people always, the first thought is it's not fair, why me? But the business should be able to answer that why me. And it shouldn't be a personal reason. It should be just about, the selection process is such that, unfortunately, there are people who are better fitted to keep, and it shouldn't be about, you're the worst one or you're the least high performing person. It should be about there are others who slightly fit our needs better for the future, or something a bit softer, rather than making somebody, they're already going to feel rejected and unloved. And a key thing for a manager to do is to make them feel valued, to try and make people feel that it's not personal, it's unfortunate, it's a business decision, but it's not personal, and they are valued, and the work they have done has been valued and is important. And if possible, the company will give them a good reference, etc., etc.
Exactly, it's a positive messages. Because it's the role that's been made redundant, isn't it? So it's trying to detach that person from you as an individual. This is the issues, this business decision regarding the viability of this role, as opposed to you as a person. It's quite key to separate.
Yeah, and the whole selection process, if it's done properly, should be very clear, and it should be very transparent. I mean, an individual shouldn't know what another person has scored, but they should be able to clearly see that there is a process, and that it's been scored fairly because of these reasons. And it'll be about how well they're doing their job. And it may not be that they're doing badly, and the company wouldn't want to lose them in normal circumstances. But if you've got to reduce your headcount, then you're clearly going to keep the people who are very best at the job, and the people who are perhaps not quite so good but are still doing well, they're the ones who have to be let go. And that's really hard. So because it's human nature that we feel as though we've done something wrong and we've brought it on ourselves, and it's rarely true.
So if it's, do you think it should be delivered, the messaging should be delivered by managers or by HR or a combination?
A combination, ideally, but it's the manager to a large extent, because the manager knows the individual better. They have got a good, hopefully good working relationship with the individual, and they will know something about the background. They'll know something about probably about their personal lives and what might be going on, and they can just be a bit more empathetic in that way. So yeah, the manager is best placed normally, but certainly most managers feel uncomfortable and like to have HR support.
And I think that I guess that whole thing about the empathy, then often the managers must find it quite hard to, if the manager, I understand, that has got the relationship and hopefully will be able to deliver the message with the greatest empathy. Would you then as HR need to support the managers? How do you support those delivering the message, or what do they need?
They need a whole load of stuff. They need, often in a big corporate situation, a manager may be facing redundancy themselves even. So they may be giving somebody else a message, but having it given to them as well, which is really, really hard to deal with. The manager needs to have somewhere they can offload, because it's really difficult to have these conversations. And so a group of managers who are all doing it, have a peer group where you can just go and talk about some of the reactions you've had, or just offload it, because it's a big mental burden to carry, especially if you're making someone redundant that you've built up a working relationship with over a long period of time, and you value them and like them. It's really, really hard to have to give them that message. So the managers need a lot of support, training, giving them that there are all sorts of things you can have a checklist. I've seen companies give them a script, which I'm not sure is the right thing, because then they just read it and it can be a bit impersonal, but certainly a checklist of all the points they need to cover to make sure that they've got it all right. They're not expected to know all the answers to all the questions that the people will raise, and the managers should know that they don't have to answer all the questions there and then. Just make a note of what the questions are and go away and find them out and go back to people.
I suppose it's from an organisation point of view, if there's a large number of them, it's about a consistent set of messages, isn't it? So that's where having a script or bullets there, because you want people to, you want to avoid the example that you mentioned earlier about somebody not hearing it. So you want the message to go over clearly, but with empathy.
Absolutely.
Those people who aren't being made, because that's also, I remember when I've seen this happen in my corporate career, one of the key focus areas, because often lots of the energy goes on those being made redundant, but the business still has to function. They're making a decision for a business reason, and this is going to have an impact on those who are staying. What's your recommendation there?
Yeah, the survivors. There's a whole chapter in my book about the survivors. It's really important that you look after them, because they are the people who are going to help your business to move forward and thrive. But they are going to be feeling very, first of all, they'll be feeling relieved that it's not them that's going, but that will be very short-lived, and then they'll start to think, well, is this the only tranche of redundancies? Are there going to be more? Am I going to be next? They'll be worried about the extra workload that may be coming their way, because half their colleagues are leaving. They may be grieving people that they worked with for a long time and are great friends with. That relationship is going to be severed in a way, and so that there's a bereavement feeling again. It's a time when they're likely to start to look for another job. So it's a really, and the word will be out there that this company is making redundancies, so competitors will be looking at taking some of those people on, and they'll be saying to them, do you know anybody else who might come and work for us? And so there's an easy access for people who are left as the survivors to find other jobs quite easily. So you really need to look after them at this point.
Yes, I can see that, because it would be quite easy if people are wobbly and then they don't, and also if they don't think you've treated those who are exiting well, that could affect their whole sort of perception of the organisation and their engagement. But equally, that whole sort of keeping them focused and feeling valued and
driving forwards and alleviating their concerns about the fact they've now got to do the work of the people who've left. That must be really, really key too. So you're having to really juggle both, managing both sets of emotions. And with the survivors, would you do that in a sort of a formal way, like you would consult with the those who are actually being made redundant? Would you sit down with people, the survivors, formally, or how would you actually physically manage?
I think it's good to give a corporate message across the board to people that this is happening, this is why it's happening. Some of your colleagues will be or are being affected, and this is really unfortunate. But the business is got plans going forward that do involve, those who are going to be left behind, and we've got, every confidence that you will help us to grow, or something along those lines. But just to, yes, tell them what's happening, because otherwise people just gossip and the wrong messages get sent out there. But you shouldn't be talking about obviously individual cases or about anything that could give people the wrong impression. So it's a difficult balancing act to get the messaging right. It's also a really good time to start looking at employee engagement and how people are feeling about the employer, because you're absolutely right, they will be looking very closely at how it's handled and whether it's been done kindly and compassionately and with dignity, because they know that sometime in the future that might be them, and it's a very good test of a company as to how they treat their people.
And there is a message as well about why something's being done, because people can, let's say, a market has changed, or a particular product is no longer relevant or viable. That's a legitimate business rationale for redundancy. If those people who are staying understand that, they can see that actually they're part of an organisation that is aiming to be profitable, to be productive, and is making strong strategic decisions. So they kind of need to understand the why and buy into it, you'd think, as well, wouldn't you, in terms of that?
Absolutely, that's critical, and it will make the difference between people staying and working with the company in the future, or thinking, no, I've had enough of this, I'm too scared, I don't like this company, I don't want to stay.
No, absolutely. So I guess, so we've covered really, the fact that if you're managing consultancy with, if you're running consultancy or talking to someone about redundancy, whether it's a group or lots of them, the main thing you said is expect the unexpected. People react in the wildest ways, whatever you expect. So being aware of that. It's good practice for it to be done by the managers, because they've got the empathy and the relationship with the HR, potentially to get support from there, but maybe give them bullet points or something to make sure that the message is consistent. Yep. Although you could do it in a smaller business, in almost one meeting, that's not good practice. You need to give people enough time to come to terms with it and to absorb the messaging. And there is this whole thing about communicating very clearly so that they don't get the wrong. So it's a balance between having lots of empathy but being clear as well, as that this is real and it is happening, and at the same time also communicating to the survivors the why, and being shown to manage people fairly and with dignity, so that you've still got good people to take forwards within the business.
Yeah, the empathy is a difficult one as well, because what you must steer clear of is trying to be too sympathetic and saying, isn't it awful, this is terrible that you're going through this. You need to be more positive for a start off, to make the person feel more positive, but also it's that person that you're giving the message to doesn't really care what you feel or what you think about it. They just want to know what is happening to them, what financial recompense they're going to get for it, and what help you as a company can give them to move forward. They don't care about how upset or bothered their manager is. I've seen managers who go into a long rigmarole about how they were made redundant in the past and how it affected them, and the person just doesn't care about that. And I absolutely understand the managers trying to be nice and supportive, but actually you need to be very clear, and the kindest thing you can do is to be clear and concise and sort of straightforward and sort of just saying it how it is, not trying to fluff it all up and give a lot of unnecessary background and stuff to it. It really is keeping it concise.
concise and sort of succinct, because it allows people then to go away from the shock rather than have to sort of share their emotion. They might want to go and think about things separately, but I can totally see how there's a temptation to over explain or over empathize, but it's making it about us. So the message, it's about that person. And I suppose I'm thinking if this was me, I think I might say, look, I'm going to be really succinct. Please don't think that I'm being I like it, I don't have huge empathy for the situation, but I don't want to confuse things. I'm just going to keep this quite clear and succinct, because it's a difficult conversation for both of us. Something like that, I think, a bit like a performance management conversation, is it probably, you can say that you're having to be concise. You could explain that it's not that it's not that you don't feel for them. You just want it to be really clear.
Yeah, especially if it's somebody that you often have quite long conversations with, then you're behaving slightly differently to the norm. But definitely explain the reasons for it, and they will appreciate that.
Yeah, I think so. So any final messages, Jill, in terms of top tips for our listeners that we've not covered?
My top tip really is to think about put yourself in their shoes, in as much as if your spouse or your child or a family member came home, or even you yourself were told you were going to be made redundant, how would you want to be treated? How would you want them to be treated? How, what would make you think the company had done the right thing by them? And if you can then do that, then you won't go too far wrong. And it's as with anything to do with HR, really, it's about listening and hearing what people say and answering questions. And if you can do all of that, you won't go too far wrong.
The great mantra for life, isn't it? Hearing and listening to people and responding appropriately. It is the mantra for life, particularly in the roles of an HR role. Jill, thank you so much for coming on the HR Uprising podcast. If anyone wants to get hold of you, I'm going to put your details in, obviously, the show notes, as I usually do, but are there anywhere in particular that you'd like them to get hold of you? Is it LinkedIn or other routes?
Yes, I'm on LinkedIn, or my website, which is heartfelthr.com. And you can buy the book there as well, and all about Heartfelt HR. So
that's wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Lucinda. Great talking to you.
I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now, you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.